How do you fast track becoming a better cook? Lots of people would say you need to read cookbooks, make a bunch of different recipes, maybe watch some cooking YouTubers. There's nothing wrong with any of these things, but the fastest way is to taste and smell what you're cooking as you go and often. It seems like I just gave you the most obvious advice in the world, but you'd be surprised at how often this goes overlooked. The more you taste your food, the more familiar you'll become with how much salt it actually takes to get delicious dishes, which really is the point of all of this. The way I think about flavor is like you're building a song. Some ingredients lay down a deep, bassy low note, while others are high-pitched and brighter. All of this is driven by salt as the tempo. Any musician friends, feel free to tell me how wrong this is and how little sense this makes. Every ingredient is enhanced by the addition of salt, so if your food tastes dull and flat, chances are your song may be a little off tempo. If you're tasting as you add more ingredients to the pot, you'll notice as soon as things are off rather than at the dinner table. As you taste more and more, you'll notice you also start salting your food as you go. For a picture, imagine building 2 different spaghetti sauces with me. In one pot, you cook the whole thing without adding salt until the very end. You brown your ground beef and your sausage, you cook your veggies, you add your tomatoes and broth, and you let it cook. As you dunk your bread in at the end to taste it like a good little Italian, you notice it needs something, so you add a few pinches of salt and it tastes better, but it still isn't glowing like your grandmother's sauce would. You think, clearly she had some secret ingredient that I don't, and you chalk it up to that. Now for the second pot. You brown your ground beef and your sausage, but you remember to add a little salt as you go. A few pinches go in the meat, and now when you cook your veggies, same story. You also notice that the veggies are cooking a little bit more nicely than the other pot. We'll get to that in a different video. When you add your tomatoes and broth, you add a little bit more salt just to make sure. When you go to dunk your bread, the sauce is really nice, but you add one more pinch to finish it off. Now it's singing and it tastes so much like your grandmother's sauce that you're taken back to a time when you were younger. Was it a secret ingredient, or was Granny a little more heavy-handed with salt than you remembered? Either way, now I want some spaghetti. When you add salt as you go, you can almost lose track of the amount that you've added. It sounds like a bad thing, but in reality, it's a good thing. It feels like a lot when you have to add it all at once. To get the same amount of salt at the end versus throughout, you'd probably feel pretty uncomfortable adding that much at one time. We're basically like tricking our minds into using the right amount of seasoning as we go. One note about the salt that may just keep you from oversalting your food is the type of salt you use. Table salt is terrible for seasoning food. Use something like kosher or sea salt. I really have fallen in love with the red box of Diamond Kosher, as it's crazy hard to oversalt your food with it. Morton's is a really good and classic choice, but can still end up a little bit too salty if you're not careful. How will you know if you're on your way to a salty dish? Well, I hope you answered it in your head. We haven't covered balancing flavor overall yet, and I'll cover this way in depth in the future, but it's important for this conversation now as well. When you taste your food, you're not just tasting for salt. If you want an absolute masterclass in this, just read Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat by Samin Nosrat. In the meantime, I'll get you up to speed with the basics. Tasting forces you to become familiar with everything going on other than just salt. How fatty the dish is, how much acid is going on, how exciting it is to eat. These are all good questions that are worth asking, especially when you've got a concept in mind for how you want the final dish to taste. For example, if you're making a vinaigrette, you know it should taste bright and exciting and acidic, so lean into that. You won't know exactly how much salt or acid you may need to add, but you can always take a little spoonful of the food, taste it, and add a pinch of salt or a drop of acid to it. If adding one makes that spoonful taste better, you're safe to add some to the final pot. What helps me is specifically this model. The more fat in the dish, the more salt it can take. The more salt you have, the more acid can be used to balance it. Balancing all 3 of these leads to a much more delicious and punchy final dish. Taste is really the only way to experience new ingredients as well. If you buy a new veggie at the grocery store, you should know what it tastes like before serving it. One of my favorite things about cooking shows is when there's a time crunch and the hosts ask the contestants if they tasted their dish or ingredients yet. When the contestant says no, we're almost just as shocked as the host is, but we honestly do the same thing at home. This just highlights the importance of taste. You can control much more of the outcome of a dish than you thought. To me, this is the most rewarding part of cooking. You don't just have to let the dish run its course. Sometimes we cook something that's kind of bad and there's not much we can do to salvage it. That happens and that's okay. That's kind of part of the process. But this happens way less the more you taste your food. Let's talk about smell for a second, because smell is almost just as important as taste. I'm that weird person that when I get food at a restaurant, I just like take a big whiff of it as soon as it arrives. Smell is known to enhance and account for a lot of our flavor experience. So it's always a good idea to make note of what your food smells like along with the taste. As a lapsed picky eater, I used to think adventurous eating was just a skill that you were born with. I've since learned that anyone can develop that skill by simply being willing to taste and smell food you may not enjoy. Mushrooms are a great recent example of this for me. The The more I cooked with them for the So You Don't Like Mushroom video, the more the smell of mushrooms cooking went from a smell that I absolutely hated to something that I found really delicious. You'll become more accustomed to newer flavors the more you're willing to get your schnoz in there. This is a ton of information, and I hope you were taking notes. To wrap up everything, tasting your food is the fast track to becoming a much better cook. There's no other way to develop a strong palate than to taste and smell as you go. This skill, like any other, can be improved with thoughtful time and work. Thank you so much for watching. This is just part of the picture to becoming a stronger cook. Be sure to subscribe if you want to see more, and shout out to the amazing and wonderful people supporting me financially on Patreon. Cheers.